Hi. So let's summarize a little bit about what you've learned about cultural relativism and moral relativism. So, cultural relativism is really a fact. We can't argue that if you've ever traveled anywhere, if you ever met anyone from a different culture, that people do in fact have different ways of behaving depending on where they live. We talked about some case studies, we looked at some of these situations. Now, you may or may not care whether or not they eat dog meat in some other cultures. I mean, you vegans, vegetarians probably will care, but it may not be something that gets you upset. But you might care about something like dowry deaths, which is a practice in India and some other countries where women who do not produce a dowry after marriage, or if their family does not produce the dowry, are chained to their stoves and murdered. Their acid is poured on them. They are killed because the dowry's not been produced. And this is a practice that has been approved or sort of condoned by certain governments. They just turned a blind eye because in that culture, it's how it's been done for ages and ages and ages. So we see that, we all kind of celebrate difference. One of the things I love the most about living in New York City is all the diversity of food and people and the different fashion that people wear, the ethnic costumes that we see. But there are things where suddenly we begin to feel concerned ethically that, it isn't okay for women to be killed in a culture if their dowries are not produced. The book uses the example of female genital mutilation, which we won't get too much in detail about. You can read more about it in the book. But that's something that we might be bothered by. We might think is a larger, more universal human rights issue. I also brought up the example of veiling. So that's something that you learned about just a few minutes ago in the readings in the Blackboard page. But I wanted to give you another example of where cultural relativism or moral relativism has been used and where we see its flaws. So here's a fashion example. Sweatshops. The whole idea of sweatshops is difficult to define. A sweatshop could be something as simple as a dark, hot place to work. It could be something as deeply complicated and even more unpleasant as a place where people are actually chained to sewing machines, where children are used for labor, where people are never allowed breaks, where there are very, very unsafe working conditions. I'm sure many of you are aware of the factory collapse in Bangladesh about 6 years ago. So, this is a big problem, and thankfully there's been a lot of conversation that's been happening in the fashion industry in particular about the problem of sweatshops and sweatshop labor. But I want you all to think about for a second, what are some of the arguments made in favor of sweatshop labor? Why have we let these corporations get away with it so far? So, if you think about it, a lot of these corporations say and continue to say, well, in that country, what we're paying these people goes a long way. Think about that clause, in that country. So even though we might be able to pay them significantly more than we are and what would be considered a fair living wage, in that country, that money's not expected. Do you see how this is a moral relativism sort of argument? We're saying that morality is culturally determined. That even though we are Nike, let's say, or some other fashion companies that operate across many different nations, that they're saying that they should be excused and that their morality only should be relevant to whatever country they are operating in. Now, some of us might want to make the argument that there should be such a thing as a universal living wage, that there should be an objective fair wage that might be based on a percentage of what the garment or the object is being sold for, instead of saying, well, in that country, we can get away with less. Do you see how this is morally problematic? It becomes a big issue. So we'll be getting into this a lot more as we go along this semester. We're obviously going to come back to fashion examples. And I partly think that fashion examples are really important, not only because many of you are students at FIT, but because, and hopefully going into the industry yourselves, but because fashion gives us a good lens to look at other broader business ethics issues. So it serves as a really good example for what we see come up in a lot of different places in business. So this cultural relativism or moral relativism argument to excuse certain unethical behaviors just doesn't hold water. And if you look back above at what I've written in this unit, you'll see that the argument that because different cultures have different moral habits, therefore there is no objective moral truth, just is not logically valid. It's not a logically solid argument. So there is objective truth, and it's up to us to find it, right? We'll go back to chapter 1, or the very, very first chapter of the book, and I read you the sentence that appears there. We need to rely on rationality to help us find that morally objective stance. So we'll talk more about it later.